Campbell. I've known him for about 16 years, since he was the priest on my pre-Cana retreat. Those of you who've gone through a pre-Cana retreat will understand when I say he was the best thing about it. As I look at his curriculum vitae and trying to think of what I can say, there's so much to say about him. But I think the very first line, which jumps right out, I think is probably what Father Bill would like most to be known about him. And probably, though I will say more, probably what he would think is enough to say about him, and anyone who knows him knows this is probably enough to say about him. The first line says, "Priest of the Holy Cross." Father Bill received his Master of Divinity from the University of Notre Dame in 1987, his PhD from the University of Notre Dame in January of 1980. He's one of these eternal students. I think some of his teachers are here as well. So, his MA, Master of Arts from the University of Notre Dame in January of 1978, the MA from the University of Queensland, September 1976, and his BA from the University of Queensland, Brisbane, Australia, 1973. He has many, many publications, lectures, awards, and so on. Here at Notre Dame, I would like to point out that he was the winner of a very prestigious teaching award, the Sheedy Award for Excellence in Teaching. That's probably the most coveted teaching award here, but I know Father Bill wasn't coveting it when he taught excellent, or taught in an excellent fashion. However, it is a great honor.
Just wanted the prize money.
Yes. He's the author of many articles, but I will just mention the books. Start in reverse order. George F. Kennan in the Making of American Foreign Policy from Princeton University Press, 1992. From Roosevelt to Truman, Potsdam, Hiroshima, and the Cold War, which just came out. It says on here forthcoming, so you should change that so you get the raise after evaluation. Cambridge University Press, and I can say, having started it, it's excellent. And he's presently working on a book tentatively entitled The Search for Influence, Catholics and American Foreign Policy from the Spanish-American War to the War with Iraq. And the title of his talk today is Catholic Politicians in the Modern World, Some American Case Studies. Father Miscamble.
Thank you. Listen, if you've come here expecting some heavy discourse on modernity, please leave now. There's still enough time to get to Tris Inglehart's session. If you've come to listen to a learned analysis of the bitter struggle between church and state in the 19th and early 20th centuries, you'll be disappointed. Russ Hittinger's plane didn't make it in, I'm afraid. Email him and try and get the text from him. If you want to know about the modernist movement, let me commend to you the talk by Father Marvin O'Connell tomorrow morning. If you're looking for some eloquent defense of a confessional state model of governance, you won't get it here from me. Not today, nor for that matter at any time. I'm not the one to mount any defense of the old regime or to promote monarchical systems. Dare I confess, I even want my own dear country, Australia, to drop-kick the poor harmless Queen of England out of our constitutional system and all the way back to Buckingham Palace. Now, before I get started on my actual subject, let me clarify that in my understanding, modernity, that bundle of ideas and practices that emerged from the Enlightenment, from the minds of philosophers like Kant and Hegel, certainly has had disastrous political consequences. Hegel's notions that the state was the highest expression of rational will and that it was an absolute in which to reconcile the will of each individual and the general will of all, led on to some twisted practical applications during the past century, the 20th century. Vile experiments, which we know as communism and fascism and Nazism. To exclude God from the earthly realm, as those experiments sought to do, proved an utter disaster for men and women. looking back on the murderous barbarism of the enlightened 20th century, surely we can affirm that those who think they can dispense with God and make a heaven on earth are destined only to create a terrible hell. Those totalitarian manifestations of the modernist impulse, however, are not the full picture as we know. The modernist turn in the liberal democracies of the West, such as the United States, led in much more defensible directions and aided the emergence of more democratic polities. My talk here today might be seen as an effort to explore just an aspect of the Catholic Church's great effort to come to terms with this modernity. This effort made, I want to suggest, during the Second Vatican Council. The specific area I will address is the role of the Catholic politician in the modern world. I begin with an effort to quickly summarize the position of Vatican II's great pastoral constitution on the Church in the modern world, Gaudium et Spes, its position regarding the role of those who pursue the political vocation. But I don't seek to provide any detailed analysis of the document. Rather, I want to look at how it was applied or not applied here in the United States. I want to see whether Gaudium et Spes penetrated to Catholics in American public life. I want to see if the teachings of Vatican II served as a guide for Catholic politicians as to how they should navigate their way forward in a political system largely shaped by modernity. Let me clarify that while the paper looks at a number of significant figures among Catholic politicians, the list of those examined is neither representative nor exhaustive. All considered in any detail are Democrats. Nonetheless, I trust that exploring their experiences might shed light on the role that Catholic politicians might play in the modern world. And perhaps, too, it might point us in directions as to how better to move forward within the modernity, which, as Alistair McIntyre reminded us last night, we're all embedded in some way, whether we like it or not. There's no escape. Now, at some point during the 2004 contest in Iowa for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination, I watched the then 9 candidates. Some of you might not recall that there were 9, and I bet not many of you could go through and list all of those 9, but there were 9 of them participating in this debate. Brief summaries were given on the screen in little text at the bottom on the background of each candidate: age, marital status, children, religious background, etc. And I noticed that 4 of the 9 listed their religion as Catholic. They were John Kerry, Wesley Clark, Carol Moseley Braun, and Dennis Kucinich. I bet you would have had trouble remembering that Dennis ran for the presidency. But let me note that it was later revealed that while Wesley Clark still listed himself as Catholic, he and his wife worshipped at a Presbyterian church at the time, so I'm not sure what category to put him in. But perhaps one might have been pleased that 4 or 3 Catholics were seeking their party's nomination for the highest office in the United States. Instead, I found myself, an interested observer of American politics and of Catholics, disappointed that these individuals were the Catholics running for the presidency. I wondered what, if anything, their religious affiliation meant for their practice of politics. On an initial examination, it did not appear to mean much. Such thinking led to reflection on how this circumstance had come to pass. Perhaps I should just blame modernity and sit down. You could have the afternoon free. But I won't do that. How had a situation arisen where Catholics running for public office seemed very detached from the moral guidance and social teaching of their church? What had happened in the almost 4 decades since the Second Vatican Council and Gaudium et Spes? This pastoral constitution, which aimed to set forth a comprehensive vision for the role which the church and its members should play in the world. Well, as numerous commentators have noted, Gaudium et Spes developed a theme of openness to the world. It is certainly not rejectionist in its approach to the world, holding off the world, spitting at the world, etc., etc. Far, far from it. It looks as to how the church might engage the modern world in its many dimensions. Its optimistic tone gave voice to a sense that there was much common ground among Catholics, other Christians, and non-Christians as they sought to work for the common good. In its second chapter, the document states clearly that God, quote, has willed that all men should constitute one family and treat one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Man's vocation was communitarian in nature. The Council Fathers emphasized the interdependence of the person and the society, the importance of the common good, and the innate dignity of every human person. These foundational principles of Catholic social teaching. Now, while the tone was optimistic, the Council was clear that there was much work to be done. For example, in fleshing out its position on the dignity of persons, the Council deemed as infamies such practices as those opposed to life itself, among them any type of murder, genocide, abortion, euthanasia, or willful self-destruction, practices that violate the integrity of the human person, and practices that insult human dignity, including subhuman living conditions, arbitrary imprisonment, deportation, slavery, prostitution, the selling of women and children, as well as disgraceful working conditions, all that quoted from Gaudium et Spes. Now, notably, the Council Fathers made clear to believers that one could not be content with a merely individualistic morality. Each person was to contribute to the common good. Everyone called. They would contribute according to their abilities and to the needs of others. Everyone was encouraged to step away from the individualistic ethic and to participate in common endeavors. Through such efforts, Christians would participate in the church's mission to serve as, quote, as a leaven, as a kind of soul for human society, as it is to be renewed in Christ and transformed into God's family. From such foundations, Gaudium et Spes approached very positively the whole issue of political participation. The Church regards as worthy of praise and consideration, the document states, the work of those who, as a service to others, dedicate themselves to the welfare of the state and undertake the burdens of this task. With the political vocation so honoured, the Council encouraged all Christians in the political community to give conspicuous example of devotion to the sense of duty and of service to the advancement of the common good. It's encouragement, if you will, for folks to enter into the political vocation. In summary, both the text and spirit of Gaudium et Spes conveyed clearly that Christian politicians were called upon to engage the modern world, not to retreat from it, to engage the modern world in ways that would promote the dignity of each person and the common good. They were to serve within their own domain as leaven, if you will. Importantly, they were not to see their political activities as separate from their religious commitments. The Council Fathers made this clear in an oft-quoted passage, which I want to give you here in full. Quote, "This council exhorts Christians as citizens of two cities, the earthly and the heavenly, to strive to discharge their earthly duties conscientiously and in response to the gospel spirit. They are mistaken who, knowing that we have here no abiding city but seek one that is to come, think that they may therefore shirk their earthly responsibilities. For they are forgetting that by the faith itself they are more than ever obliged to measure up to these duties, each according to his proper vocation." And then it goes on. Nor, on the contrary, are they any less wide of the mark who think that religion consists in acts of worship alone and in the discharge of certain moral obligations, and who imagine they can plunge themselves into earthly affairs in such a way as to imply that they are altogether divorced from the religious life. This split between the faith which many profess and their daily lives deserves to be counted among the more serious errors of our age. The council was very clear. Quote, "Let there be no false opposition between professional and social activities on the one part and religious life on the other." Now this is key. Whatever its efforts to engage the modern world, Vatican II made it clear that it could not accept a compartmentalization of religion into an essentially private sphere. In this sense, it refused to succumb to the modern tendency to marginalize religion and to separate it from most significant areas of life. Nonetheless, the Council Fathers, in my view, set forth an approach to the political vocation which might guide politicians in a modern liberal democracy. Sadly, it has not been adopted as the guiding paradigm for American politicians in the subsequent 4 decades. In order to understand why this was so, it's necessary to set a context. The key part of that relates to John F. Kennedy's election to the American presidency in 1960 and the conditions to which he readily agreed so as to secure his election. The election of a Catholic to the presidency in 1960 was undoubtedly a milestone. Kennedy's election seemed to shatter the last political barrier obstructing America's acceptance of Catholics. Kennedy's apparent idealism, the willingness to conquer new frontiers, etc., and then his tragic assassination locked him into a revered position in the American public mind, perhaps in your mind. Certainly many Catholics accorded him such treatment. Father Andrew Greeley even asked in 1967 if JFK should not be canonized because he had put to rest forever the fear that Catholicism was an alien religion and that Catholic political leaders would use their positions to interfere with American freedoms. Yet, in the perspective provided by the last 4 decades, it seems clear that the election of a Catholic to the presidency meant little in terms of the impact of religion on public policy. The election of JFK I want to argue, meant only a conditional acceptance of Catholicism into the mainstream of American life. It was an acceptance made on conditions which Kennedy explicitly promised he would accept, that he would relegate his religion to a purely private status, and that he would not act on public policy in any recognizably Catholic way. As James Hitchcock noted, this promise was rendered immeasurably easier by the fact, revealed later by a number of people, including his wife, that President Kennedy was neither very devout nor very knowledgeable about his religion. Perhaps his old man should have sent him to a Catholic school at some point. That was reserved for the girls. JFK does not appear to have been overly influenced by religious worldview or by religiously based convictions. Both critics of him, like Gary Wills in the Kennedy imprisonment, who finds JFK essentially rootless, and court historians like Arthur Schlesinger, who claims that JFK took religion with, quote, detachment, agree on this. Now, who knows what role faith plays in someone's inner life? But the external evidence suggests that JFK was, if you will, a political Catholic, a public persona maintained because it was essential to his winning office in Massachusetts, and then a problem to be dealt with when seeking higher national office in a nation, it should be noted, still very suspicious of Catholics. In narrow political terms, JFK dealt with this issue effectively in the 1960 campaign. As a political issue, the Kennedy campaign handled it brilliantly. In his famous speech to the Protestant ministers in Houston in 1960, he advocated a form of church-state separation, which was pretty extreme, and essentially the privatization of religion. His religion would not influence how he exercised public office. He would compartmentalize his faith. And by and large, he kept his promise. Certainly, he did not seek to press specifically Catholic aims, such was pushed upon him at times by Catholic lobbying groups, such as, for example, including some funding for parochial schools in his federal aid for education bill. This, by the way, his refusal to do that, led Billy Graham to observe of Kennedy that he turned out to be a Baptist president. Just want to say that for the Baptists present here. But the absence of any effort to push for Catholic goals on this institutional level, I think, can be defended easily on the grounds of political realities. Protestant watchdogs waited like circling vultures to accuse him of favoring his own denomination. Why would he give them such an opening? But more notable is the lack of values or foundational principles for the Kennedy administration. It was rooted, if that is the term, in what one writer has called modern pragmatism. Matters of right and wrong were not important. Rather, the issue was what would work? What would further the political success of the Kennedy administration? What would assure JFK's re-election in 1964? The very cautious Kennedy stance on civil rights is surely evidence for this. The common good and the dignity of all human persons were not the guiding bedrock principles. So, the impact of the election of a Catholic rather ironically meant a further triumph of the secular in the public sphere, as Mark Massa has demonstrated so well in his book, Catholics in American Culture. Sadly, JFK succumbed to modernity's demand that religion be compartmentalized, that it be held in the private sphere. And, even more sadly, he blazed a trail which many subsequent politicians Catholic politicians followed. Documents from the Second Vatican Council would hardly have some privileged role in guiding Catholic politicians. Many would tend to look instead to the approach pursued by the most successful Catholic in American politics to that point, the one who had succeeded where poor Al Smith had failed. Now, Gaudium et Spes, which I am suggesting offered excellent guidance for how Catholics should engage modernity in the political arena. Gaudium et Spes received Pope Paul VI's signature in December 1965. Its initial impact on the United States, coincided with a period in which the optimistic mood which began the 1960s was considerably tempered. Nonetheless, the efforts of the Johnson administration in civil rights, in its war on poverty, seem broadly in sync with the thrust of the pastoral constitution in regard to promoting the common good and enhancing the dignity of persons. Catholic liberals seem supported in a general sense by the social teachings of the Council, while conservative Catholics like William F. Buckley expressed reservations about the work of Vatican II. Catholic liberals took heart from the pastoral constitution. After 1966, two liberal Catholic senators increasingly moved towards the center stage of American politics. They were, of course, Eugene McCarthy and Robert F. Kennedy. In 1968, they emerged as two of the top contenders for the Democratic presidential nomination. Robert Kennedy was a more tribal Catholic than Eugene McCarthy. RFK felt his religion much more deeply than his brother, and it certainly influenced his values and his approach to public policy, especially after his so-called conversion experience following his brother's assassination. He emerged as a man deeply concerned for the common good, a man who could genuinely identify with suffering, who possessed an aptitude for empathy. His biographer, Arthur Schlesinger, would describe him as the tribune of the underclass, deeply committed to social change, which was similar to the solidarity with others of which the Council Fathers had spoken in Gaudium et Spes. RFK displayed qualities of compassion and courage, which appeared rooted in religious and moral conviction. His emphasis on strengthening community, pursued from 1965 to 68, certainly seemed in sync with the spirit of the Council. Eugene McCarthy, more so than either Kennedy, was clearly a Catholic, a man whose public stance and intellectual outlook reflected an inner commitment and temperament characteristic of Christian democracy, as one writer has put it of him. Born in rural Minnesota, McCarthy attended St. John's University in Collegeville, where he developed a firm grasp of and commitment to the principles of Catholic social thought. McCarthy was a long-time contributor of articles to the liberal Catholic magazine Commonweal, and as Roger Van Allen commented, he was a person to whom the tag Commonweal Catholic might suitably be applied. He clearly saw politics as a vocation, and he rejected the privatizing of religion. In his book, Frontiers of American Democracy, published in 1960, McCarthy argued that a religious politician, if he were whole, quoting him, was necessarily driven by faith. McCarthy explained that both his liberalism and his anti-communism emerged from his faith. He stood in stark contrast to the views that JFK put before the Protestant ministers in Houston. I want to suggest that both Robert Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy, in their different ways, gave hope of modeling for a new generation of Catholic politicians a way of relating religious convictions with political endeavours that would be in line with the call of the Second Vatican Council. Sadly, little came of this hope. By 1968, when McCarthy and Kennedy campaigned for the Democratic nomination, US involvement in the Vietnam War had come to dominate the American political agenda. Both McCarthy and Kennedy emerged as opponents of Lyndon Johnson's Vietnam War policies, and their candidacies had an oppositional tone which precluded them putting forth a full and positive vision. And of course, neither of them gained power, and so neither was able to demonstrate through action the full nature of his approach. Robert Kennedy was slain in Los Angeles in June of 1968, and Eugene McCarthy lost the nomination to Hubert Humphrey, and with it, it seems, he lost his bearings. He went into what Irving Howe, who worked in his campaign, described as a prolonged sulk. He left the Senate and the world of serious politics behind. This was a tragic loss, as he was a politician gifted with the intellectual powers to forge a public approach which combined concern for the dignity of the individual with concern for the common good. We can utter those sad words in his case, oh, what might have been. Not only did the year 1968 see the removal of RFK and McCarthy as potential exemplars for Catholic politicians, it, along with the sort of surrounding years, also marked the occasion for an enormous upheaval in the United States. Vatican II had referred rather optimistically to the churches contributing to the social and cultural transformation of the world. You can look back and read, and you think there's a certain innocence about some of that hope that they possessed. But that had been their hope. But the late 60s saw unleashed a series of forces that changed significantly the arena in which Catholic politicians would be called upon to work. We can only allude to these forces here, although one gets a sense of the magnitude of them if one takes seriously the judgment of a very sober historian, not given to large claims, my dear colleague Philip Gleason, who said that during this decade, the nation as a whole experienced its greatest upheaval, indeed crisis, since the Civil War. At the very time the nation went through this upheaval, the Church, through the work of the Council, set about a series of changes in its practices and institutions that left Catholics in what Gleason termed, I think with some understatement, a state of confusion. It was hardly an easy combination. All that was happening in the nation, all that was happening in the Church. In Gleason's view, quote, the turmoil unleashed by the racial crisis, the Vietnam War and the protests against it, the New Left, campus riots, the sexual revolution, the drug culture, and other manifestations of social, political, and cultural radicalism greatly augmented the more specifically religious destabilization caused by Vatican II and the post-conciliar spirit. These years marked a challenge to traditional institutions and authorities, including political, educational, and religious. And in this atmosphere of considerable dissent, Pope Paul VI's encyclical Humanae Vitae, issued in July '68, sparked a severe American reaction. Many Catholics simply rejected the encyclical's ban on artificial birth control, and encouraged by various theologians and opinion leaders, they fell back on the argument of individual conscience to justify their stance. It seems that the new attitude to church teaching in the area of sexuality and birth control flowed quickly into other areas. The emphasis came to be placed on the individual's consideration of the church's teaching, take it or leave it. This emphasis was completely in line, of course, with what in hindsight we can now see as one of the key driving forces of the 60s revolution, namely individualism and atomization. Emerging from the 60s came an ethos of personal liberation, sexual freedom, self-fulfillment, etc. And rather strangely, this ethos found its political home in the Democratic Party, especially with the so-called McGovernization of the party during the 1972 campaign. The party that had been the traditional home of Catholics from the mid-19th century onwards began to move in directions decidedly contrary to some of the social teachings of the Catholic Church. And in particular, the efforts to legalize abortion intensified in the late 60s, and these put special stress on the alliance between Catholics and liberals that had proved so successful in American politics from the time of FDR's New Deal. Let me just add that this whole question of the transformation of the Democratic Party and the difficulties of Catholics within it is a very complicated story. My colleague John McGreevy, in his work, has pointed out the important part that race played, working class Catholic resistance to forced busing and integration of neighborhoods, etc., also plays a significant part in all of this. But anyway, strangely, as this remarkable transformation of the Democratic Party, especially at the national level, took place, most Catholic office holders largely stood by and acquiesced in the process. Edward Kennedy, the third prominent Kennedy brother in politics, quickly overcame any reservations about the new direction of the Democratic Party and became a vocal spokesperson for it. For a combination of reasons, which we need not note, he wanted to stay in the good graces of the increasingly influential women's movement. Kennedy's brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, George McGovern's eventual running mate in 1972, and a deeply serious and committed Catholic, tried to hold to what I would call a Vatican II vision, in shorthand terms, a pro-life Democrat vision. He wanted to use and did use the language of the common good, but he met only electoral defeat in the Democratic primaries during 1976. Without any great or significant debate, the social cultural liberalism of the contemporary Democratic Party quickly took control at the national level with its emphasis on individual autonomy and privacy. Catholic Democrats, even old-style New Deal Catholic liberals like House Speaker Thomas P. Tip O'Neill, discovered that to get ahead one must go along with what seemed the new dominant wing of the party. Dear old Tip, personal favorite of mine, he had an aunt who was a nun, and he could get all worked up over specific issues, which he saw as sort of coming out of his faith. He was always very concerned about Reagan administration policies in Central America. Marian old sisters would come back and brief him, etc., and Tip was very responsive. But he lacked the political and intellectual capacity to fashion how a Catholic politician should appropriately pursue his public vocation. Indicative of the triumph of what I call the privatization of religion, the new expression developed that while one was personally opposed to something on moral or religious grounds, one could not seek to impose one's views on others. One must leave decisions to their individual choice. This approach was certainly in evidence in the campaign of the Catholic Congresswoman Geraldine Ferraro in her run for the vice presidency in 1984. Ferraro's position appeared to develop from the political requirements necessary to make her way in the Democratic Party. She gave no well-considered defense of it. This task fell to the then governor of New York, Mario Cuomo, who gave a much publicized address at the University of Notre Dame in 1984. Cuomo announced that he accepted the teaching authority of his church, and he accepted specifically its doctrine on abortion. but he refused to concede that this should lead him to support either legislation or a constitutional amendment to limit or ban abortion, which, if you accept the teaching of the church, would certainly seem that abortion and the way it was being applied in the United States would certainly suggest that it had reached the level of a gross abuse of the dignity of the persons involved. Instead, Cuomo appealed to what he called Catholic realism, suggesting that any ban on abortion would be divisive and would not work anyway. Thus came his fundamental principle: the values derived from religious belief will not and should not be accepted as part of the public morality unless they are shared by the pluralistic community at large by consensus. Thoughtful commentators relentlessly dismantle Cuomo's so-called Catholic realism principle, asking if it should be applied on other great moral questions, such as racial discrimination. What became apparent was that Cuomo joined JFK in consigning his religious convictions, at least on certain matters, to a private domain. And like JFK before him, he provided helpful cover for the battalions of "I'm personally opposed but" Catholic politicians who lacked the courage to take a principled stand on the abortion issue, which had emerged as of central importance. Cuomo's refusal to do anything to build a political consensus in opposition to abortion confirmed the moral bankruptcy of his stance. If he had insisted that abortion was morally wrong, an evil which needed first to be contained and then placed in the course of ultimate extinction, as his hero Abraham Lincoln had said of slavery in 1858, his position might have proved more defensible. Instead, Cuomo insisted on campaigning for public funding for abortion to make it even more readily available. He defended one of the most permissive abortion regimes in any democratic nation, even when it was apparent that the American public preferred at least some restraints to access to abortion. The privatized religion model triumphed despite the efforts and appeals of those who pushed the consistent ethic of life, seamless garment approach in the 80s, and the courageous witness of the pro-life governor of Pennsylvania, Robert P. Casey, who was denied the opportunity to speak at the Democratic Convention in 1992. Abortion and support for it had become a litmus test in the Democratic Party at the national level. The increasingly blunt pronouncements from official church teaching regarding the responsibilities of Catholic politicians, pronouncements in encyclicals like Evangelium Vitae in 1995 and the doctrinal note on some questions regarding the participation of Catholics in political life, went largely unnoticed. Hence, in 2004, John Kerry could describe himself as a believing and practicing Catholic, yet there was a sense that he was guided essentially by the same, quote, modern pragmatism that had guided his hero, JFK. 40 years on from Vatican II, Kerry wanted to make it clear, just as JFK had done, that he would be a president who happened to be Catholic, not a Catholic president. Perhaps not surprisingly, he came across as a secular, Ivy League-trained Massachusetts-type liberal. Kerry had difficulty speaking in religious terms or conveying anything of his religious outlook beyond some unproblematic generalities. Harkening back to JFK, he tried to suggest that one's personal religious conviction should be kept out of politics, and he claimed a New Englander's reticence to discuss his faith in public. He indicated little familiarity with Catholic social teaching, and on a range of controversial issues, he adopted positions which placed him in explicit opposition to his church's formal teaching. He went to Mass regularly on Sunday, got ashes on his forehead on Ash Wednesday, but didn't seem able to convey that religion shaped his public outlook, perhaps because it didn't. in any meaningful way. Sadly, we must conclude that the vision for how Catholic politicians might engage the modern world, as set forth in Gaudium et Spes, has been it's had minimal impact at best. Catholic politicians have hid behind the notion that religion is a private matter and have blended in and refrained from utilizing their religion as an inspiration and guide for their actions. And this, despite the fact that fundamental problems of the American polity and society, decline of community, unrestrained individualism at the expense of the common good, growing income disparity and economic insecurity, rampant relativism in values, etc., these had presented a unique opportunity and challenge to Catholics in the public domain. Of course, the private religion excuse has spread far and is now very well implanted among the increasing number of Catholics in the Republican Party, such as George Pataki, Rudy Giuliani, and Arnold Schwarzenegger. They read from the same script. Prospects for any rapid change seem dim. In fact, the recent elections will bring back into prominence such a group, we might call them the willing assimilationists to modernity, as Edward Kennedy, John Kerry, Patrick Leahy, Richard Durbin, as chairs of Senate committees and so forth. Such men, who in my view, their worst selves are usually on display during hearings on Supreme Court nominees when they compete with each other to demonstrate their support for Roe v. Wade and the abortion regime it permits, they have perfected the compartmentalization approach. It's a sad spectacle. And yet, let me end by speculating in an optimistic manner that the situation is possibly, just possibly, changing. The 2004 election result, in which a Baptist president got well over half the Catholic vote while running against a Catholic candidate, mind you, another Catholic senator from Massachusetts, this suggests to thoughtful Democrats, even those of the secular modernity wing of the party, epitomized by Howard Dean, that if they want to win, and they do, who goes into politics just wanting to lose, if you want to win, they might need to pay a little more attention to the religious outlooks and sensibilities of voters, both Catholics and others. Might we say there are opportunities at the present time to rethink how religion might influence the outlooks of politicians, opportunities to move beyond the privatization model which prevailed all too often in the 4 decades from JFK to John Kerry. And I want to suggest that in Pope Benedict's encyclical, Deus Caritas Est, there's a wonderful, succinct, brief section that gives us a reminder of how this might be pursued. Formal separation of church and state, and yet faith, religion as a guide and inspiration for those who pursue the political life, aiming, of course, to work for a more just society. Looked at in the long view, 40 years isn't that long a time, is it? We are still receiving the teachings of the Second Vatican Council, still understanding its depths. I want to suggest that a bit of a wrong turn, more than a bit, a significant wrong turn was made in the refusal of many Catholic politicians to take up the guidance of Gaudium et Spes. The task ahead for those gathered here, however, is to dedicate ourselves anew to seeking to convey that one's religious convictions, one's faith, should not be divorced from one's political actions. Those of us involved in the work of education might take special heart from the call of Gaudium et Spes for the education of youth so as to produce those great-souled persons who are so desperately required by our times. We need them now more than ever. I hope they're here in this audience and will think of the political vocation themselves in the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Father Bill, for that enlightening and very good talk. Father Bill will take his own questions, I think, and we have plenty of time, so go right ahead.
Yes.
Hi, thank you. Two questions that are somewhat related. I wondered if first you could shed some light, perhaps historically, just on how the abortion issue became so central and such a defining characteristic for the Democratic Party, and why did this become the litmus test? And it's so central. The second question, I wonder if you can maybe shed some light on what Gaudium et Spes and its teaching on the vocation of the politician might have to say to a Supreme Court justice who, not being in a legislative role, but rather a person who, if he's to work according to the system in which in which his role is, precedent and so forth, in other words, what should the Catholic Supreme Court justice do? How does their faith become integrated into their work in that field?
Okay. On the first question, it's a fascinating thing to study how abortion gravitated to the Democratic Party, because in its initial stages, the great folks who were pushing and moving for greater access to abortion, this is in the 1960s, tended to be liberal Republicans of the Nelson Rockefeller School, perhaps influenced by all the work on population control, etc., that the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation had done. So in the 1960s, ironically, the Democratic Party tended to be, of course there was still a sizable Catholic role and influence, they tended to be the ones who opposed any liberalization. I have to attribute it, as I tried to outline here, to the sort of crack-up of the Democratic Party that happened from 68 to 72, brought on by the enormous divisiveness of the war, of the Vietnam War as an issue. And what happened was that a sort of a sizable group of, if you will, these sort of old-style New Deal Catholic Democrats, who may have had their own problems, but, you know, of the Mayor Daley school, they essentially were ramped out of the party. And a whole new generation of folks who had come, if you will, of age in the 60s, peopled the McGovern campaign and took over the national organization. In that process, they were products in some ways of the personal liberation, et cetera, they seized control of the party, and it needs more work. Why the old style, if you will, Catholic Democrats laid down so easily? This process was aided, I mentioned the issue of race. This was aided by sort of complications within the party on the race question and the weakening of the Democratic Party in the South, which had also proved to be something of a barrier to the sort of total triumph of the social liberal group, you know, very socially liberal group in the party. So I think the issue quickly occurs from 68 to 72, and by 1976, when poor old Sergeant Shriver is running as a pro-life Democrat in the Iowa caucuses and so on, he can't get any traction whatsoever. Of course, it didn't help that he was being undercut by Edward Kennedy, who thought, oh my God, Teddy thought he would run again in 1980 after news of Chappaquiddick had died down, etc. And he didn't want Sergeant Shriver building any organisation, so they deliberately sought to chop him down. But his lack of success, I think, spoke to a lot of folk, hey, there ain't no money and there ain't no foot soldiers in pushing a pro-life stance, and they gave up. It's a sad story, I think, because I would say philosophically, the Democrats, with their broader concern, at least on paper, for the common good, should see the abortion. It should be philosophically natural for them to think of concern for all persons, and didn't happen. Now, as for the Supreme Court question, that's a very complicated one. I don't think someone who accepts an appointment to the Supreme Court can say, I am going to be guided just by the social teaching of my church. The practice of working from precedent is well established in Anglo-American law, and it's a practice that in many ways I think serves the common good extremely well, and folks work from that practice. However, I think it's fair to say that if one looked at, say, the reasoning of Justice Anthony Kennedy in the Casey decision, where essentially he says, well, we all make up our own views of the world and being and persons and so on, I would say dear Justice Kennedy might have benefited a little if he had taken Catholic teaching a little more seriously and wouldn't have come up with such outrageous rubbish as that.
I was wondering if you could expand with regard to the situation of Republican Catholics and the potential for them in light of recent developments. You mentioned the Giuliani or Schwarzenegger type of Catholic who is socially liberal, but we've also had a very public Catholic perspective put forth by somebody like Rick Santorum, who is more aligned to sort of like a neoconservative type of a Catholic, I would think. And he lost in this last election largely because of his support for the Iraq War. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the prospects for Catholics in the Republican Party who would be very committed to Catholic teaching. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. On the specific Pennsylvania Senate race that pitted Rick Santorum against, of course, Governor Casey's son and namesake, Robert Casey Jr., that I think was an interesting exemplar of what I'm suggesting might be something of the new thinking in the Democratic Party, where folks like Howard Dean and Chuck Schumer went all out to make sure that Casey would get the nomination and that he would get sufficient monies to win, even though he held to his pro-life stance. Now, within the Republican Party, which after all, up until 1960, and in some ways even until 1980, was a fairly Protestant party. Catholics found no easy home there. There's been a significant transformation. There are a whole raft of folks like Rick Santorum, Sam Brownback, etc., who want to vigorously say, my religion helps shape what I'm about, the issues I pursue, etc. Let me admit my own personal biases here. I wish they were a little more concerned about the ravages of the free market, etc., and applying those aspects of Catholic social teaching. But in the case of Rick Santorum, from what I know of him, his efforts to address poverty questions, etc., deeply admirable. I think he went down because of a general dislike and general feeling of the Bush administration's terrible incompetence in the Iraq War, etc., etc. So I don't want to read too much into his specific case, but I take it as a good thing that Catholics might be able to find their political home in either of the great political parties and seek to use their influence as best they see. The Church offers broad principles. How they're to be applied can vary dramatically, precisely on questions of the role of free market, etc., etc. So there are any numbers of ways in which Catholics can approach a variety of issues like healthcare or whatever. So I see it as a good thing that Catholics can find a home in the Republican Party. It's a commentary, I think, on how someone like Rick Santorum, from a fairly working class background, would have found his home there. Commentary perhaps on what I've been talking about of what happened in the Democratic Party. Hope that answers it a bit. Sorry, a bit rambling there. Yes.
Reverend Miscamble, could you say something about the politicization of American Catholicism in the 20th century? I'm thinking, for instance, of the terms conservative Catholic, liberal Catholic, rather than terms like faithful or unfaithful on points of doctrine. Could you explain perhaps how that evolved?
Sure. This is in some ways perhaps more Father O'Connell's area, but this was present right at the outset of the 20th century in American Catholicism. The modernist movement, liberal Catholics, etc., sought to push particular views and were pretty much pounded down. I'm moving into dangerous territory here by moving much further beyond that rather general stance. And yet, while that happened on a doctrinal level, on an economic and social level, especially through the work of Monsignor John A. Ryan and what eventually became the U.S. Catholic Conference from 1919 into the 1920s and so on, there was an enormous effort to push the Church's social teaching. Catholics, for the most part, were working class, lower middle class folks. They were beginning to make it in America, but it's not really until after the Second World War and the GI Bill and so on that their great advances, socioeconomic advances, take place. So there's the Church concern for the economic and social well-being of folks. In some ways, it's a great aspect of 20th century Catholicism, in my view. So that, particularly with Al Smith, but then following with FDR and the New Deal, there's sizable American Catholic support for the Democratic Party. That identified with the Democratic Party right from the start, this weird amalgam that's sometimes called a political party. The solid South joined with these urban Catholics from the North. Who could have come up with such a coalition as that? But liberalism is sort of pounded down on a doctrinal level, but on a socioeconomic level, Catholics find plenty in which to agree with FDR's New Deal and get support, etc., etc. So there have always been in the Church folks, you know, a bit more conservative, a bit more liberal on these questions. We're not talking about anything that's particularly new. Sometimes the venom in debates strike folks as sort of a new quality in contemporary debates. But in 1960, JFK got upwards of 70% of the Catholic vote. There was enormous support for him and deep pride in him. And I think there's been a sort of a withering away of that, and folks arguing about what sort of directions Catholics should go. And I think it's feasible for a liberal Catholic to be a faithful Catholic, and feasible for a conservative Catholic to be a faithful Catholic, if what you're talking about is approach to political, socioeconomic issues. I don't know if I'm really getting to what you're getting at there, so I ramble forward.
Sorry. No, I was thinking more the redescription of lack of fidelity on doctrinal matters as a political stance, or the casting of all of one's positions on doctrinal matters as political. So then it then becomes merely a prudential decision. Just as it's prudential whether I'm a Democrat or a Republican, then it's prudential whether I agree with birth control or not. Did that happen at a specific point in the 20th century, or is that just...
Well, I tried to say that Andy Greeley would argue Humane Vitae is this crucial moment. All of his research says there's this rejection of that teaching, and from that point forward, folks adopt much more of a buffet approach to teaching. You take what you like and you have it, and you sort of focus on that, but you keep other stuff at bay. So I think it's around that late 60s period, driven by a lot of these vast social forces and movements which I mentioned, which lead to it. So it's around that time. Dan?
I would like you to speculate. I think some of the answers you've been giving touch on this area, on the fringes of it, but the advantages and disadvantages of a two-party system for the kind of Catholic participation in politics that the council seems to imagine. I mean, one thinks of a parliamentary system where maybe a party gets a plurality, but really can't govern without putting a coalition that might involve even 6 or 7 different political units. And within that, then, even someone who's very much in a minority can exercise an influence and get at least a certain attention for what would be a minority agenda. Whereas in our two-party system, it seems, once you put a platform together and so forth, you have to buy into so much to go along with the gang that you could easily be excluded if you're idiosyncratic, or you might be invited to sign on to some items that you really couldn't live with. So two-party...
No, I think it's a great difficulty in the present context, because some folks who might have reservations about, let us say, current Republican approaches on economic issues, which I'm not claiming expertise, but seems to involve a little bit of redistribution of income upwards. To the wealthy, more should be given, and you could have deep reservations about that. That normally would encourage you to go to the opposite political party, who's presumably representing something different, but you find there key support for the most liberal, one of the more liberal abortion regimes in the world, all sorts of support for stem cell research, et cetera, and someone goes, where do I belong? Where do I belong between these two parties? Now, you could form your own party and try and fashion something that might have some philosophic coherence. I don't think either of the two parties are particularly blessed with great philosophic coherence. So I acknowledge the difficulty of it. Neither party seems to me to jump out. I would say, however, that there are certain issues that strike me as more important than others. I would argue the life questions are more important. And so sometimes maybe holding your nose you choose in light of the most important of those questions.
Perhaps one more question?
We'll try and take a few.
Father, I had a question about what kinds of arguments Catholic politicians should make in the public sphere, and also what kinds of arguments they should consider when they're trying to decide what kinds of policies to support themselves, especially given the autonomy of the secular sphere. And you mentioned Deus Caritas Est at the end of your talk, and from what I can remember, if I remember correctly, 2 points that Benedict made in that encyclical are, one, religion can raise questions that we may have forgotten about or that we may not have considered on our own. and also that religion can kind of purify our goals or our desires or our activity.
Yeah.
But not necessarily that we support a certain policy because it was divine, like because it's based on divine revelation or because it's based on the magisterium of the church. But if maybe reason can act as an intermediary here, and maybe what should be interesting about Catholic politicians is not so much that they're Catholic, but that they're reasonable and that their faith helps them to be more reasonable. So that's.
Yeah, it depends what you would define as reasonable there. I think using reason, if that's what you mean by reasonable, using reason, definitely so. Benedict is very clear that the just ordering of society and the state is the central responsibility of politics. People are involved in politics and pursuing the political vocation. So that's what I see, that Catholic politicians, informed by their faith and seeking to work towards these fundamental goals that help shape them, concern for the common good, that means concern for the weakest, the poorest in the society, the least able to promote their own interests. Catholic politicians should be concerned about them. So they would be concerned about the common good and promoting the dignity of every person. Now, as I say, how that gets worked out in practice is the work of politicians, of developing specific policies. In some ways, I think there's something to the criticism that's occasionally been made of the US Catholic Conference, that there's been too much specificity in some of their recommendations, that it should be left to this other sphere, the sphere of politics, to sort out that kind of stuff. But I'm suggesting that a Catholic politician is going to have as his or her central purpose working out of these guiding principles and being quite explicit that their faith is indeed a guide for them in how they think about it, not saying, my faith is just sequestered off over here. I would have been willing, Bernie, if you want to ask your question. And do we have to get out of this room?
No.
Mary?
I'm just trying to be
Yeah.
a
Sorry.
good servant to David Solomon.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. Yeah,
think,
we're supposed to finish at a set time or something.
I think
Bernie.
it's important to realize that two very prominent Catholics were present by special invitation at the inauguration of John F. Kennedy.
Yeah.
One was John Courtney Murray, and the other was Jacques Maritain. And it's those two who, by their doctrine and by their teaching, formed the basis for Dignitatis Humanae,
Yeah.
the basis of which was the freedom of individual consciences. It can't be imposed upon. Can't force a conscience. I think it's in a pluralistic society, which was one of the doctrines of Maritain from integral humanism, and for which he was attacked for a long time by the church, by members of the church. In a pluralistic society, is it possible for somebody to really believe that certain forms of abortion are not immoral and still be in good conscience? If this is so, and I think there are many Americans like that, and you have remarked to the fact that we ended up with a Baptist, an evangelical Baptist president, and it's, you don't want to decide whether we would have been better off if we had Kerry, but it seems to me that one of the reasons we did get our Baptist president is because several bishops told their dioceses, for example, Cardinal Burke in St. Louis, said that any Catholic voting for Kerry has to go to confession before he goes to communion, which means that voting for Kerry would be a mortal sin, in my understanding. Bishop Chaput of Denver said the same thing. The difference between the number of votes, and some counting says that even that others had won, the number of Catholics who listened to the bishops and voted against a pro-choice candidate, Kerry, would perhaps have made all the difference if they had not listened. So do you think it's proper for bishops to tell on a single issue Catholics in a society, a pluralist society, how to vote? This recalls to me after the war, a very prominent Catholic theologian, Garrigou-Lagrange, who for a time was the chaplain of the Maritain group at Meudon, wrote that any Catholic, any priest who gives absolution to a Catholic who votes for General de Gaulle, that priest is living in a permanent state of mortal sin. Now, that's a very solid statement. Do you think it's proper for bishops to tell Catholics how they're supposed to vote?
You raised a number of things there. I appreciate you mentioning that John Courtney Murray and Jacques Maritain were present with the Kennedy inauguration. Of course, dear Cardinal Cushing gave the opening prayer, etc. What I regret, however, is that that's about the extent of the role they were then called upon to play. And isn't it possible that just on occasion, I stand corrected if JFK was calling Jacques Maritain in to talk about Christian humanism on a regular basis, was he?
No, but John Courtney Murray was his advisor during his campaign.
He was an advisor on how to deal with the Catholicism problem in the campaign. What I'm asking is, did JFK ever think that perhaps Jacques Maritain might be a guide for him in providing the philosophic principles that would guide his administration? And as far as I can tell from my reading, the answer is a clear no. So it's good to have them there. It's a classic Kennedy showpiece operation. I'll move onwards to the bishop's question. I think at a certain point, some Catholic bishops feel torn. They are supposed to be the spiritual leaders of their diocese, their flock, and they see a group of politicians who don't simply say, look, I am opposed to this, but you know, I'm going to work by a range of policies to try and restrain or restrict abortion. Instead, what they see are politicians who go to a NARAL rally and outdo each other in testifying how hard they're going to work to maintain access to every measure of abortion possible, partial birth, the whole darn thing. And at a certain point, they think, gee, we get all this criticism for not speaking out on this issue or that issue. Perhaps we should speak on something. Now, there's a division among bishops. I think Cardinal McCarrick, his approach of saying, look, let's try and work privately and talk to these folks and encourage them, etc., that's a valid approach. But I don't want to be too critical of folks who have seen for 30 years a kind of explicit flaunting of church teaching in the most disgraceful manner. I don't think I personally would recommend the Archbishop Burke in St. Louis approach, but I can understand, if he takes the teaching seriously, how he might be motivated to speak like that. I can understand it. I think it's probably a good idea for everyone to go to confession regularly, no matter what they're doing. Thanks very much, folks.
Father Bill's intelligence, but also his passion, remind me of the great Catholic, English Catholic writer Hilaire Belloc, And there's a story, perhaps apocryphal, though the Belloc scholars could correct me, that when Hilaire Belloc was running for a seat in Parliament in Wales, there was quite a bit of controversy as he went to Wales, that this Catholic would dare to run for a seat in Wales, and all sorts of things about Rome and popish plots and rosaries and so on. So he came to the first meeting with the potential constituents, and he stood up and he said, "I am a Roman Catholic." And he pulled out of his pocket a rosary, and he said, "And this is a rosary. And every day I get down on my knees and I say this rosary. And if you're not going to vote for me because of that, you can all go straight to hell." It was reported that they applauded very hard for him, but I don't actually know whether he won the seat. Please join me in thanking Father Bill.